Hey everyone, my name is C.T. Wilkes. My pronouns are they, them, and my partner Ben and I will be talking to you all about families with transgender children, sharing ways to support trans children in your families, and also sharing resources for trans children and their families. So here's a little overview of what we will be covering. I think it's really important to start off with terminology about gender so we can dispel any misconceptions. And we're also going to be talking about specifically early childhood for trans children, what that looks like. So this is between the ages of 2 and 6, roughly. We'll also discuss what gender dysphoria is and what social transitioning is, and also other clinical issues associated with being trans. And lastly, we're going to share some extra resources and ways to support both parents and caregivers of trans children and trans children themselves. So I know this looks like a lot, but I promise I will make it as simple as possible. So oftentimes when people are talking about trans issues, they tend to conflate gender and assigned sex, right? So when I say assigned sex, that just means when a baby is born, a doctor or a midwife looks at their external anatomy or their genitals and puts a label of either male, female, or intersex on the birth certificate. So this is just based on what they can see externally. Now, this is different from gender identity. Gender identity is more about a person's inner sense or understanding of themselves as being more male or more female. Sometimes it's a combination of genders, or sometimes there's no gender at all. Now, gender identity typically is expressed, right, externally. And so this is where gender expression comes in. Now, this is how a person presents themselves to the world. Usually they want to present themselves in a way where they are perceived as their gender identity. So this can be done through behavior. It can be done through clothing style, haircuts, even sometimes like a person's voice or mannerisms. Now, all of this gender is different from sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is just about who a person is romantically or physically or emotionally, spiritually attracted to, right? Now, you may be attracted to people of the same gender or a different gender. You may be attracted to all genders or not any genders at all. So, in the broadest sense, transgender, or trans for short, is just an umbrella term, right, to describe a person whose assigned sex at birth differs from their gender identity, right? So under this category, you may find people with gender identities such as non-binary, transmasc, transfemme, two-spirit, which is an indigenous word. You might also find people who identify as agender or no gender, pangender, gender fluid, gender queer. There's a bunch more, but those are probably ones you hear most often. So it is important to note that people who fall under this trans umbrella don't necessarily use the word trans to identify their gender, right? So a non-binary person might identify as, a non-binary trans person, or they might just solely identify as non-binary. So that is important to note, so that when you're interacting with a person who falls under this trans umbrella, you use the terminology, you use the language that they use to identify themselves. So cisgendered or cis is just a term to describe a person who, let's say, was assigned male at birth and their gender identity is a man, cisgendered man. So they match in terms of assigned sex and gender identity. So early childhood for trans children. So just early childhood in general is considered approximately between the ages of 2 through 6 years old. So in this time, children are developing all sorts of new skills, gaining more autonomy, more emotional understanding, and emotional competence. They're able to recognize pain in themselves and in other people. And they're also gaining more self-managing skills. And they're also have this ability to relate to other people. And this includes them having an awareness of gender and racial differences and even disabilities. And so earlier research has had this perception that trans children are too young to really know their gender identity. And it doesn't really seem to be the case in more recent research. For instance, it's saying that children between the ages of 18 and 24 months actually do have a pretty good grasp on being able to label people by gender and use gendered labels or language on a consistent basis. So this perception that they are confused or maybe developmentally delayed is completely false. So more recent research is saying that trans and cisgender children are actually pretty similar in how they respond in terms of behaviors and their preferences for stereotypical, girl clothing versus boy clothing, or toys, and peer relationships too. So another, actually even more recent study was found that children who were assigned male at birth that had a really stronger feminine preferences and gender identities were more likely to be living as girls 2 years later than those who were assigned male at birth, who exhibited less feminine preferences and gender identities. So it seems that children around this age actually do have a pretty good understanding of their gender identity. One study was saying that by the age of 3, actually, that children are showing a basic sense of self as either male or female, which is hinting at them expressing and knowing their gender identity.
Okay, so looking a little bit more into this term gender dysphoria and where it comes from, how it's defined, maybe what it looks like, what it presents like in a child. This term comes from the DSM-5. It's a textbook used by licensed clinicians in order to diagnose and treat clients who may be experiencing one of the highlighted diagnoses. And for this specific one, it's gender dysphoria within children. And in order to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria, a child must show 6 of the following for at least 6 months duration. And these bullet points right here are all the criteria listed in the DSM-5, recently revised. So this is a 2022 version of what it would look like. And just to go over a few of them, a child will have a strong desire to be of the other gender, or an insistence that one is the other gender or some alternative gender different from one's assigned gender. In boys who are assigned that gender, you may see a strong preference for cross-dressing or simulating female attire, so like wearing dresses or maybe wanting to wear more skirts, or in girls who are assigned that gender, a strong preference for wearing only typical masculine clothing and a strong resistance to the wearing of typical feminine clothing. So that would mean maybe a resistance, not wanting to wear a dress, not wanting to wear maybe what people would consider feminine colors, or, not wanting to wear skirts. Another criteria, a strong preference for cross-gender roles and make-believe play or fantasy play. Also a strong preference for the toys, games, or activities stereotypically used or engaged in by the other gender. And also a strong preference for playmates of the other gender. In boys who are assigned that gender, a strong rejection of typically masculine toys, games, and activities, and a strong avoidance of rough and tumble play. Or in girls who are assigned that gender, a strong rejection of typically feminine toys, games, and activities. Also a strong dislike of one's sexual anatomy. They may feel like their genitalia doesn't fit in their body. They don't feel like it's right. They have a distaste towards it. And also they may have a strong desire for the primary sex characteristics that match one's experienced gender. So looking at all this, we can get kind of an idea of how it will be presented in a child. Just because a child may be experiencing or showing one of these criteria, though, doesn't mean that they absolutely have to be diagnosed. I mean, remember, they have to be experienced at least 6 of these, and it's for at least 6 months' time, and that's to be diagnosed by a licensed clinician as well. Now, looking at this, we can see a lot of big clinical terms coming out, especially if you're doing your own research on your own child or someone you may know. Diagnoses, mental health disorder. A lot of them may come with negative connotations, but for the purpose of these diagnoses, this shouldn't be seen as a judgment of character or as demeaning in any way. It's more a tool just for a clinician to use to kind of help build, a treatment plan with a client, and maybe help them define what the diagnosis could mean in their life and how they want to move forward with it. It shouldn't be a judgment of their character. Rather, it should be seen as a tool that clinicians can use to help develop a treatment plan with client, and help develop goals that will move in a positive direction for the both of them. Okay, so now we're going to show a quick video about Jazz Jennings. She's a transgender female. She was diagnosed with gender dysphoria at the age of 3 and transitioned at the age of 5. At the time of the recording, she's 14 years old, but it shows a lot about her lived experiences as a child, a lot of those mixed emotions, you can see a lot of the criteria from the previous slide being represented in there, and even looking forward in the presentation a little bit, talks about her transition, her mom talks about the lack of support, and I'll let the video take it away.
I want to get it straight in the camera.
Someone asked me why I used to be a boy and now I'm a girl. I would say that I have a girl brain and boy body, and it's different than you.
Is it okay to be different?
Yes.
Do you like it? Because why?
It's okay to be different. It's okay to be different because it just matters who you are.
Hi, I'm Jazz. I'm 14 years old and I am Jazz. Right from the start, I always knew I was different, and I knew I was a girl, and the way I just really expressed that to my parents was by gravitating towards Barbies, dolls, dresses, everything very feminine.
We really didn't have too much of a decision to make to allow Jazz to be Jazz because she decided for us. She really didn't give us a choice. She was a girl in her mind, and she was adamant about it. In the beginning, there was very few families. There was one support group that I found. They gave me the confidence to allow Jazz to be who she was, because it was hard. There weren't little transgender kids like Jazz at the time.
At age 3, I was diagnosed with what's now called gender dysphoria. That was a turning point in my life. At age 5, I fully transitioned. That was only the beginning.
My name is Jazz, and I'm transgender. I was born a girl, trapped in a boy's body. And although most people would run away from who they are, I embrace my uniqueness.
So many people tell me that I'm brave and that I'm courageous, but for me, the real brave and courageous people are the transgender individuals out there who are completely shut down by their families, their friends, their schools, anywhere, just society in general, completely spreading them hate. And still they find deep in their soul and their spirit to keep moving forward every single day until they come to that point where they can live their lives authentically. Those are the brave and courageous people. So many transgender kids take their lives because they just feel so depressed based on what society is telling them.
If you are reading this, it means that I have committed suicide. Those words
she was
written
born
on
Joshua
a Warren County
Alcorn, but wrote in her suicide note Sunday she wanted to be remembered as Leela.
My death needs to mean something, were a few of her final words.
You know, I worry about her, of course. I worry about all my kids, but with her, there's special circumstances because transgender people are hated by other people out there.
When our family decided to share our story in the media 9 years ago, we were all very scared. We made sure no one knew where we lived for my personal protection. But now I'm happy to share with you that I'm an out and proud resident of South Florida.
Kids can be cruel, they can be so mean, so I'm hoping in high school they really mature up and maybe they'll accept me a little bit more, because I know a lot of boys right now, they don't accept me. They think that if they date a girl like me that they'll be called gay by their friends.
I think that transgender people are probably discriminated against more than any other group of people and feared or whatever reason, because people don't understand. And why would anybody be so hateful towards a child? How can you tell a child that you want to kill them?
You know, the main thing that really keeps me motivated in continuing to share my story is the fact that I know that change is being created. When I see that, you know, it's happening, like this is real. People are really inspired to just keep living and being their authentic selves, and it just motivates me to keep going.
So I hope that video was just as powerful for other people as it was for me. I thought it was a very good in-depth look at the true lived experience of how transgender children can go through such a hard process. I mean, you can see the stigmas and the fears surrounding it, but it was really good to see, as we'll talk a little bit later in the presentation, about the supportive parents and especially the open line of communication at such an early age. It really does allow for more growing and better mental health outcomes within transgender children. And the idea that they can have that line of communication and that relationship so early is just amazing. She goes a lot more in depth in the article if anyone ever wants to check it out. It's a good read. And I believe that she serves as a great representative and advocate for the trans community. So a little bit about the clinical issues that present within transgender children. I think sadly it's no surprise that prepubertal gender expansive children and their families within the United States are increasingly seeking care. Children meeting the diagnostic criteria for gender identity disorder had elevated levels of internalizing symptoms compared to cisgender peers, and just over half of them also met criteria for at least one other co-occurring mental health condition. There was one single pilot study in the United States that found that 71% of them met diagnostic criteria for at least one or more DSM-5 diagnoses. So from this, they hypothesized that they're experiencing higher levels of psychological stress resulting from minority stress factors, such as adverse experiences related to one's gender identity and expression, expectations of for rejection, and victimization related to one's gender experience, including bullying at school. This could be harassment at school, isolation, societal views, peer and family relationships as well. There has been growing evidence that suggests that social support is linked to better mental health outcomes among transgender adolescents and adults, which suggests the possibility that within social transitions in children, a form of affirmation and support by prepubescent child's parents could be associated with good mental health outcomes in transgender children, even going as far as showing that socially transitioned transgender children who are supported in their gender identity have displayed normative levels and minimal elevated levels of anxiety when compared to their cisgender peers.
So what is transitioning? To my definition would be living authentically or more authentically. And that's done through the process of altering the way you appear, changing your appearance and how others perceive you and treat you in order to become closer aligned with the gender that you identify as. So trans people have a bunch of different ways that they may utilize to transition, but it's important to note that they do not have to utilize every single one of these options in order to be valid in their trans identity or to be valid as the gender that they identify with. So some people will socially transition, legally transition, or physically / medically transition, or sometimes all of the above. For the purpose of our presentation, we're just going to concentrate on social transition since we're talking about really young children. So a social transition is just living as one's gender identity, and that can be done through adopting the name, pronouns, clothing, or hairstyle or haircut that most closely aligns with that person's gender identity. And more recent research is actually showing that socially transitioning for trans children can have desirable outcomes. Now, I do want to point out that most of the research out there on socially transitioning for trans kids is looking at adolescents or teenagers. There's not a lot on prepubescent children, but the one I did find said that those trans children who were allowed to socially transition before starting puberty actually had less depression compared to previous studies where children were not able to socially transition. And so they compared the trans children who were able to socially transition to cisgender children, so of their same age, and relatively they were similar in terms of normative depressive levels and anxiety. So here are some good places to start when you are supporting your trans or non-binary child. Start off by always using the child's name and pronouns that they tell you most aligns with their gender identity. Make sure other people in your family or social network are doing the same. Educate yourself more on challenges that they face. You can also talk with your child's school, let them know about the child's name, pronouns, and discuss other ways that teachers can provide support. And just connect with affirming groups and people. Reach out to online support groups or in-person support groups. Find other families with trans or non-binary children. And find events that are inclusive of all gender identities.
So there's not been a lot of research on young trans children, 2 to 6 in school environments, but one study discussed ways principals and school communities can help trans kids have positive experiences at school and to help lessen the bullying, harassment, and discrimination. One of these ideas being taking a child-centered approach. Principals take a child-centered approach by meeting social and emotional needs of the child and making sure that their trans identity and well-being are considered when making school policies, such as, we can see bathroom policies, dress codes, school uniforms, things like that changing. Also learning the language and acquiring knowledge of transgender experiences. This may mean school staff and educators need to challenge old ways of thinking about gender, not confusing it with sexual orientation, so they can keep up with the current scientific resources on transgender issues. It also means using the language or terms a trans child uses to refer to themselves and believing that the child knows their gender identity instead of writing them off. Also, there could be collaboration between parents and teachers to facilitate social transition. One parent worked with the school to craft a letter describing her child's social transition and wanted to share it with her child's classmates and their parents or guardians. It commonly asks questions and answers to help the other parents talk with their young children about the trans child. If the child's not comfortable with outing themselves, parents and schools can work together to create teachable moments for students about it without disclosing a student as trans. And moving further, also adding transgender books to school library and discussing gender in the classroom of the trans student, at least when allowed and not restricted by state legislation or school policies, such as we can see in the recent state legislation in Florida, how it's made it difficult for gender and sexuality to be discussed in classroom settings with the Don't Say Gay bill. So taking a look at the family life cycle, a little bit more of a systemic approach, we're going to be looking at parenting and families of young children. These families are learning to adapt to the new family system, and they're also learning how to integrate the young children into it, while the parents' roles and responsibilities are going to be changing as well. The couple needs to assume responsibility for their children while also maintaining responsibility for one another, with the inclusion of the extended family system, including people who are becoming grandparents, aunts, uncles, etc. Families with young children who express gender nonconformity, though, will have a number of additional tasks. They must develop coping and advocacy skills to respond to their children, relatives, friends, schools, other societal influences, while also incorporating the needs of the gender-expansive child into the family life. They need to provide a space where the children can openly communicate a language that they feel comfortable with, and also in a manner that they feel comfortable with. By having a nurturing, supportive, and loving home, it actually works as a very powerful buffer against the types of bullying and oppression that they may face. So it kind of becomes a family's job just to provide unconditional support and acceptance as their children discover who they are in the world and how they want to name and present themselves. So as we can see, parents are going to play a very important role in protecting their children because they have the power to limit exposure to gender-based victimization, and they can promote adaptive coping and resilience in the face of adversity. During their children's transitions, they may experience a wide array of emotions such as worry, shock, grief, and loss, which can actually interfere with their ability to have a positive impact while playing the role of the parent, and could also be due to their own negative experiences having a child who is transitioning, which includes things such as encounters with peers, family, and societal responses to their child's gender experiences. One way of support, though, can be parental coaching, which can help parents move from feelings of helplessness into becoming an empowered resource for their child, and it allows them to work through challenges they may encounter in the process of supporting their child's development. Another way is also through parent support groups that can provide key peer support opportunities, giving caregivers not only space to discuss potentially complicated feelings related to their child's gender identities and expressions, but also gives opportunities to share information and local resources and learn from one another's parenting experiences. Meeting and building relationships with these other parents of gender-expansive children can also serve to reduce feelings of isolation, which can help alleviate some of the parenting stress that could be going on. And another way could also be connecting parents of gender-expansive children to transgender adults in their communities. Could also be beneficial in reducing parental anxiety about their children's futures and associating parenting stress. Just a few of the resources that we found. You got the Trevor Project. It's a 24/7 lifeline number for LGBTQ youth in crisis. There's also genderspectrum.org. They have a national parent support group, which is actually a live online call-in peer group where parents can support each other and find helpful information on the journey of raising transgender, non-binary, or other gender-expansive children and teens. Another organization, Trans Youth Family Allies. Next, we have a book, self-care book for parents of transgender children, and also a book, picture book for children who may be gender expansive. It goes a lot more depth. There's a lot more options on the handout that goes with this presentation. And here's a few of our references. Me and Cece are very grateful for your time. We hope you learned a lot about this demographic and have some very valuable takeaways. And thank you for listening.